The envelope hit the table before I could process what it was. Not slid, not placed. Hit. The way a man puts something down when he wants everyone in the room to hear it land. The chatter around me stopped in sections. First the people closest to us, then the ones by the window, then the back of the room, until the only sound left was the soft instrumental playing from the speaker in the corner, and the quiet hum of 200 people deciding whether to breathe. I had spent 27 years building a reputation in this city. Senior Vice President at Brookside Regional Medical Center, founder of Delaney Health Consulting, the woman they called when something needed to get done and done correctly. This room, these faces, were the proof of that. Donors, physicians, department heads, board members, community partners. People Wendell knew would be talking about this before the valet line cleared. And Wendell Tharp had just turned my retirement gathering into the stage for something he believed would corner me publicly before I had time to react privately. He was dressed well. He always dressed well. That was the thing about Wendell. He understood the importance of appearance. He stood across the table from me with the kind of stillness that told me he had rehearsed this moment. Not emotionally, logistically, the timing, the witnesses, the pressure of a room full of people watching a woman decide whether to break apart in public. His attorney's name was already on the paperwork. Douglas Peel. I had seen that name before, in a context Wendell did not know about. I picked up the envelope. If you are watching this and you have ever had to hold yourself together in a room full of people while something inside you was coming apart, you already know what the next 30 seconds felt like. I am Rayatha Delaney. And I need you to stay with me because what happened after I opened that envelope is the part nobody in that room saw coming. What time are you watching this? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. I read every page. Not quickly, carefully, the way I read every document that crossed my desk for 27 years. My hands were steady. I made sure of that. Wendell had always believed pressure made people careless. That was one of the reasons he thought doing this publicly would work. When I finished, I took the pen from my jacket pocket, my own pen, not the one he'd brought, and I signed where the flags indicated. A quiet shift moved through the room, not shock anymore, confusion. I handed the papers back without a word. Then I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me, and I said 7 words. The pension, the firm, the record, all mine. Something moved across his face. Just for a moment, a flicker of something that wasn't quite certainty anymore. Then it was gone. He laughed. Not a quiet laugh, a full, open, performative laugh. The kind designed to carry across a room and reclaim control before doubt could settle in. The kind that says, she doesn't understand the paperwork. The kind that says, this is already finished. A few people near him shifted uncomfortably. Someone by the door looked at the floor. One of the cardiologists from Brookside picked up his drink and slowly stepped backward, like he suddenly realized he was standing too close to something private. I stepped back and straightened my jacket. That was when I saw her. Audria was standing near the far wall, a glass of water held with both hands, her eyes fixed on Wendell with an expression I cataloged and filed away. It was not shock. It was not discomfort. It was something quieter and more specific than either of those things. The expression of a person watching something unfold exactly the way they expected it to. I did not know yet what that expression meant. I would. In 3 months, I would understand every detail of what Audria already knew in that room. But standing there in the middle of my own retirement gathering, with Wendell's laugh still hanging in the air and 200 people pretending not to stare, I understood one thing clearly. He thought that laugh was the end of something. It was the beginning. Let me tell you what 27 years actually looks like. It does not look like the version Wendell told people at dinner parties. It does not look like the man who smiled beside me at hospital galas and shook hands with my colleagues and accepted compliments about my work as though proximity to it was the same as building it. It looks like me at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, reviewing contracts for Delaney Health Consulting while he slept. It looks like me negotiating my first VP position at Brookside Regional while simultaneously managing a household he never had to think about because I made sure he didn't have to. It looks like a woman who decided early that the only way to protect everything she was building was to make it look effortless, because the moment it looked like work, someone would try to take credit for it. Wendell was not a bad man in the beginning. That is the part that makes it complicated. He was present, engaged, occasionally proud. He contributed a steady income, a stable household name, a partner who showed up when showing up was easy. But there is a specific kind of man who can walk beside a woman, building something extraordinary, and slowly, quietly, begin to resent the fact that it is extraordinary. He does not announce the resentment. He doesn't even name it to himself. It just begins to collect. In the way he rephrases your accomplishments when he repeats them to others, in the way he positions himself at the center of stories you lived without him, in the way he stops asking about your work and starts making small comments about how much time it requires. I noticed. I always noticed. I simply chose, for years, to file it under the category of things marriages absorb. The first thing I could not file away was a Sunday evening in the spring. Tercel and Audria had come for dinner. Wendell was talking, holding court, the way he did when there was an audience. And Audria made a quiet, precise observation about something he had just said. Factually correct. Calmly delivered. Wendell looked at her for a moment the way you look at something that has made an inconvenient sound, and then he continued as though she had not spoken. Tercel did not react. I watched Audria's face settle into a specific kind of stillness. Not embarrassment. Something older than embarrassment. Recognition. She had been here before. I filed that away too. The thing that ended my trust in Wendell did not announce itself. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary in every way except for one detail, his phone, face down on the kitchen counter, which was not where he usually left it. He had gone to shower. I did not touch the phone. I did not need to. What I needed was already in front of me. The deliberateness of the placement, the angle of it, the fact that a man who had never been careful with his phone was suddenly being very careful. I stood in my own kitchen and understood something that I would spend the next several months confirming. I did not cry. I did not confront him that night. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up a document I had been drafting for the consulting firm's next quarter. And while my fingers moved across the keyboard, one part of my mind, the quiet, precise part that had kept me alive in boardrooms for 27 years, began to watch my husband the way I watched everything that required managing. Carefully, completely, without him knowing. My assistant knocked twice before opening the door. "Mrs. Tharp is here. She says she doesn't have an appointment, but send her in." I had not spoken to Audria outside of a family context in several months. We were cordial, genuinely so, in the way that two women can be when they recognize something in each other that the men around them have never bothered to notice. But this was my office, my professional space, and Audria had never come here uninvited. She walked in carrying herself the way people do when they have made a decision that cost them something to arrive at. Straight back. Careful steps. She sat down across from my desk and placed both hands flat on her knees, and that was when I knew. Her hands were pressing down, steadying herself. I did not rush her. She started with the practical details, the way people do when the emotional ones are too heavy to lead with. 4 months ago, she was precise about the timing. She had been in the kitchen at their house when Wendell called someone from the living room. He had not closed the door completely. She had heard a name, Douglas Peel. She had heard a date that matched my announced retirement exactly. She had heard the word pension used 3 times in 4 sentences, followed by the phrase before she can protect it. She stopped, looked at her hands. "There was a woman's name," she said. "Desiree." The room was very quiet. I watched Audria gather herself for what came next. And what came next was the real reason she was sitting in my office. Not the phone call, not the date, not even Desiree. Christmas, 8 months prior. Tercel had stepped outside to take a work call. Wendell had looked at Audria across the kitchen counter and said something to her that she repeated to me now in a voice so flat, it told me she had drained every emotion out of it just to get the words out. I will not repeat what he said here. What I will tell you is that it was specific enough to confirm he had been thinking this way for a long time, and cruel enough that no woman should have had to absorb it alone in a kitchen on Christmas, while her husband stood 30 feet away discussing football scores on the patio. "He'd been drinking," Audria said quietly after a moment, not excusing him, clarifying him. Not drunk, just comfortable enough to say what he actually thought. That detail mattered. Because monsters are easy to identify. Comfortable people are harder. She had not told Tercel, not because she was protecting Wendell, because she had watched, over the course of that marriage, how quickly difficult truths became minimized once they entered the orbit of male loyalty and family preservation. She had wanted certainty before she brought him something that could not be taken back. So she waited. She listened. And when she overheard the call about my retirement date and the pension filing, she understood the shape of what Wendell was planning well enough to know silence had become participation. "When you announced the retirement party date," she said, "I knew he was going to do it there." That was the first moment I understood why Wendell had chosen a room full of witnesses. Not impulse, strategy. Public humiliation creates pressure. Pressure creates mistakes. And Wendell believed that if he cornered me in front of 200 people, I would sign quickly, emotionally, without thinking clearly enough to protect myself first. He had built the entire plan around that assumption. When Audria finished, the silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 women who understood each other without requiring explanation. I stood up. I walked to the small table near the window where I kept an electric kettle and 2 mugs, a habit carried over from years of difficult conversations that needed something warm to anchor them. I made her tea. We did not speak while the water boiled. When I handed her the mug, she looked at me with something in her eyes that I recognized as relief. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying something alone and has finally set it down in the right place. I walked her to the door. I thanked her. I meant it. Then I sat back down at my desk, pulled my personal phone from the drawer, not the office line, and scrolled to a name I had saved 3 weeks earlier after a quiet recommendation from a colleague at Brookside, Sylvia Drummond. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Sylvia Drummond's office did not look like a place where people came to lose. It was precise, ordered, the kind of space that tells you the person who occupies it has never once confused motion with progress. She was already standing when I was shown in, mid-50s, natural haircut close, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like she had just set something down to give me her full attention. She shook my hand once, firmly, and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Tell me what you know," she said. "Not what you feel, what you know." I told her, all of it. Audria's visit, the phone call, Douglas Peel's name, the date, the pension, Desiree. I spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. When I finished, Sylvia removed her glasses from her forehead, set them on the desk, and was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she opened a folder. The Alabama RSA pension system operates under specific state rules, she said. Not generic federal templates, state-specific administrative requirements, which means a QDRO, the court order required to divide pension interests in a divorce, has to meet RSA language requirements exactly. She slid a sample document across the desk. Wrong classification, wrong calculation method, wrong alternate payee language. Any one of those deficiencies can trigger rejection. She paused. And timing matters just as much as wording. I kept my expression neutral. And Douglas Peel? General practice family law. She said it without contempt, the way you state whether. Not incompetent, just procedural. He uses standard template filings because in most divorces, standard filings work. Private pensions, retirement accounts, basic marital division structures. She tapped the sample document once. The RSA is not basic. That distinction mattered. Because if Douglas Peel had been reckless, this would have been easier. Reckless people make visible mistakes. Careful, overconfident people are harder to manage because they usually believe experience is the same thing as specialization. What happens if he files standard language? I asked. The RSA rejects it and sends it back for correction if the administrative window is still open. Sylvia folded her hands. But every correction attempt consumes time. And retirement systems move on their own schedule, not the attorney's. She held my gaze. Once retirement elections finalize and benefit processing crosses certain thresholds, corrective review becomes substantially harder, sometimes impossible depending on timing and structure. Impossible. Administratively barred, she corrected calmly. Not dramatic. Just closed. The room was very quiet. Sylvia leaned back slightly in her chair. And I need you to understand something else. If Douglas realizes quickly that he is outside his depth and brings in pension counsel immediately, this changes. A specialist could identify the deficiencies early enough to preserve review rights before activation completes. So, this only works if he stays procedural. It only works if he stays confident in standard practice long enough to lose time, she said. And even then, there are no guarantees. The RSA can reject a filing and still allow cure if the timing remains open. That mattered more than false reassurance would have. I want to be very clear about that, Rayatha, Sylvia continued. You are not walking into a guaranteed victory. You are managing timing, preparation, and probability. This was the moment I understood what kind of attorney Sylvia Drummond was. She did not sell certainty. She sold clarity. What about the firm? I asked. Delaney Health Consulting is in your name. Established before the marriage? Re-established and restructured 4 years into the marriage. But the founding documentation is mine. Then we document the restructuring trail, establish what qualifies as marital contribution versus independent growth, and formalize everything that already exists. She made a note. The firm is defendable, but it has to be documented correctly before he starts digging through discovery. She looked up at me. The pension is his real target. That is where his strategy lives or dies. The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at the folder in front of her, already tabbed, already organized, and understood that Sylvia had done preliminary work before I walked through the door. She had known, from the shape of my phone call alone, what kind of case this was going to be. I asked her the only question that mattered. If I retire on the date already announced, the date he has built his entire strategy around, what does his filing window actually look like? Sylvia looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up her pen, wrote a single figure on a notepad, and slid it across the desk. I looked at the number. I looked back at her. There was risk in it. Real risk. If Douglas corrected the filing fast enough, if he brought in a specialist early enough, if timing shifted even slightly, the outcome changed. But Wendell believed he had already won. And certainty makes people slow. Then I won't change the date, I said. The most dangerous thing a woman can become is quiet. Not silent, not withdrawn. Quiet. The specific, deliberate quiet of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. No announcement. No visible urgency. Just the steady, methodical work of a woman who has spent 27 years understanding exactly how things get built, and therefore exactly how they get protected. The 3 months between Audria's visit and the retirement gathering were the most focused months of my professional life. And nobody knew that except Sylvia. Not Tercel, not Phyllis, not Wendell. Especially not Wendell. The first thing Sylvia and I addressed was the consulting firm. Delaney Health Consulting had grown considerably since the early years of the marriage. Client base expanded, contracts with 3 county health departments, a staff of 9. Wendell had never been involved in its operations. But involvement is not required for a claim. Duration and marital proximity can create arguments even where direct contribution does not exist. Sylvia identified every document that needed formalizing, every operating change that needed clearer timestamping, every separation between personal and business assets that needed to be reinforced before discovery began. We were not inventing ownership. We were tightening documentation around what had already existed for years. That distinction mattered, because if this ever reached a courtroom, appearance alone would not protect me. Paperwork would. Each week I met with Sylvia for 1 hour. We reviewed what had been completed, what remained, and whether anything had shifted in the landscape. She never used more words than necessary. I respected that about her. And there were moments, several of them, when she reminded me the outcome was not guaranteed. If Douglas brings in pension counsel early, she said once without looking up from her notes, the RSA issue becomes significantly harder to contain. Another time, if discovery turns up commingling we haven't accounted for, we adjust. Not panic, adjust. She refused to let me romanticize preparation into certainty. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. The assets Wendell believed were jointly accessible were, one by one, documented into structures that reflected what they had always actually been. Mine, built by my decisions, sustained by my professional relationships, protected by records that predated his strategy by decades. We did not manufacture anything. We simply made visible what he had chosen never to examine closely. I continued going home every evening. I continued making dinner twice a week the way I always had. I continued sitting across from Wendell at the kitchen table and discussing his day with the appropriate level of engagement, because the alternative, withdrawal, coldness, anything that registered as a change in pattern, would have told him something had shifted. And I could not afford for him to know that yet. That was the hardest part. Not the legal work, not the documents. The sitting across from a man I had loved for 27 years, watching him believe he was managing me, and understanding that the most powerful thing I could do was let him keep believing it. Some nights, I lay awake wondering whether Sylvia was wrong about the timing, whether Douglas Peel would recognize the RSA issue early enough to correct course, whether I had already waited too long. I never let those thoughts stay long. Fear is useful in short doses. After that, it becomes noise. Clarity is not the same as coldness. I want to be precise about that. What I felt during those 3 months was not hatred. It was not bitterness. It was something closer to the feeling I had in the early years of building the firm. The particular focus that arrives when you understand exactly what is at stake, and you decide, without drama, that you are not going to lose without a fight. The night before the retirement gathering, I sat at my desk after Wendell had gone to bed. Sylvia had confirmed 2 days earlier that everything presently within our control was in order. The documentation was clean. The restructuring was complete. The exposure points we could address had been addressed. The rest depended on timing. I thought about the envelope I knew would arrive tomorrow. I had known its contents for 4 months. I said the 7 words out loud once, quietly, to no one. The pension, the firm, the record, all mine. They sounded calm, not victorious, prepared. I turned off the desk lamp and went to bed. The divorce filing came through on a Wednesday. I sat with the documents for an hour before I did anything else. Not because I was surprised. I had been expecting them since the retirement gathering. But because there is a difference between knowing something is coming and holding the paper version of it in your hands. It makes it real in a different way. Flatter, more permanent. What I kept returning to was not Wendell. It was Tercel. My son had not called me since day 0. Not a text. Not a message passed through Audria. Nothing. And I had not reached out to him either. Not because I was punishing him, but because I needed to understand what his silence actually meant before I decided what to do with it. So I went back. 4 months before day 0. The same week Audria had come to my office. Tercel and Audria had come for Sunday dinner, one of those ordinary evenings that only becomes significant in retrospect. Wendell was in a particular mood that night. Expansive. The kind of mood that made him generous with his opinions and careless with his words. We were at the table when he said it. He was speaking generally, or performing generally, about sacrifice and compromise. The way men sometimes do when they want to say something specific without being accountable for saying it. And then he looked briefly in my direction and said that building a life with an ambitious woman costs a man things he never gets back. The table went quiet. I looked at Wendell with the same expression I used in boardrooms when someone said something that revealed more about them than they intended. Audria looked at her plate, and Tercel, my son, 34 years old, a man I had raised to understand the value of what a woman builds, looked at the table and said nothing. Not nothing in the way of someone caught off guard. The silence stretched long enough that he could have interrupted it if he wanted to. He picked up his glass instead, took a sip, bought himself time the way people do when they are trying not to become part of a conflict they already recognize. Then he changed the subject. Not forcefully, carefully. A question about football. Something work-related. I do not even remember the exact pivot anymore. Only the feeling of watching my son steer the conversation away from danger instead of through it. At the time, I told myself he was uncomfortable, that he was trying to keep peace between 2 people he loved. And part of that was probably true. Tercel had always hated confrontation. Even as a boy, he preferred managing tension quietly over standing directly inside it. He was the kind of child who tried to calm arguments before deciding whether something deserved defending. But sitting with the divorce documents now, I understand something more difficult. Avoidance is still a decision. What I understand now, sitting with the filing on a Wednesday, is something that makes Tercel's silence more complicated than betrayal. He did not know about Audria's visit. She had kept it entirely private, told him nothing, given no indication that she had done anything outside the ordinary rhythms of their life. Which means when Tercel sat across from his father that Sunday and chose silence, he was not choosing Wendell over a mother who had already begun protecting herself. He was choosing comfort over disruption, neutrality over risk. And somewhere underneath that, whether he admitted it to himself or not, he was also backing the side he believed would win. That is its own kind of answer about a person. I did not cry about it. I want to be honest about that. I did not sit in my living room with the filing documents and grieve loudly. What I felt was quieter and more durable than tears. It was the specific weight that arrives when you love someone without condition for 34 years and discover, in a single, recalled moment, that they have been keeping a ledger. He had a mother who never once asked him to choose, and he had chosen anyway. I set the documents down, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the window for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then I went back to my desk. There was still work to do. Sylvia placed the discovery documents on the desk between us without comment. She did not editorialize. That was her way. She gathered information, organized it, and presented it with the same neutrality she applied to everything, letting the facts carry whatever weight they carried without her assistance. I pulled the folder toward me. Desiree was 37 years old. She worked as a senior coordinator at a logistics company in Hoover. Steady position, consistent employment history, the kind of professional record that speaks to a person who shows up and does what is required. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Birmingham. No property, no significant assets. A car paid off 2 years prior. Nothing in that file suggested a woman looking for a shortcut. Audria had filled in what the documents couldn't. She had met Desiree once, briefly, at an event Wendell had brought her to under a cover story that Audria had believed at the time and only later understood. She described her as composed, quietly optimistic, the kind of woman who laughs at the right moments and asks questions that tell you she was actually listening. What Wendell had told her, this was the part I sat with longest. He had told Desiree that he owned the consulting firm, not that he was connected to it, not that he had proximity to it, that he owned it, that Rayatha had been his employee in the early years, that the marriage had evolved into an obligation he had honored far beyond what it deserved, and that once the legal process concluded, there would be a settlement substantial enough to start fresh. A house, stability, the life she had been carefully, patiently working toward. He had been specific about the house, size, location, the yard she had mentioned wanting. Liars who use specific details are the most convincing kind. They understand that vagueness creates doubt and specificity creates belief. Wendell had always understood that. It was, in its way, the same skill that had made him a convincing partner for 27 years. The ability to be precise enough about what he intended that you stopped questioning whether he was capable of delivering it. I closed the folder. What I felt sitting across from those documents was not what I expected to feel. I had prepared myself for something harder. Anger, perhaps, or the particular humiliation of imagining the version of yourself someone else constructed for their own purposes. What arrived instead was something quieter. Recognition. Desiree had been handed a story and trusted it because the person telling it sounded certain. She had organized her hope around specific details, a yard, a house, a life that felt permanent, because Wendell had been careful enough to make those details feel like evidence rather than performance. I knew what it was to trust a specific man. I knew what it was to build your understanding of a situation around the information he chose to give you. The difference between Desiree and me was not intelligence. It was not character. It was timing and access. I had eventually seen behind the presentation. She had not yet. I slid the folder back across the desk to Sylvia. "She doesn't know," I said. Sylvia looked at me. "No. What he actually has." I was not asking. "What he actually has," Sylvia confirmed, "is considerably less than what he described." The room was quiet for a moment. I thought about a woman in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Birmingham, still waiting on a life that was never going to arrive the way she was told it would. I did not hate her. I never did. Sylvia called me on a Thursday morning at 8:47. I know the time because I was standing at my kitchen window with my first cup of coffee, watching the neighbor's dog investigate the same patch of grass it investigated every morning. And I looked at the clock on the microwave when my phone rang because Sylvia never called before 9 unless something had moved. "The RSA responded," she said. No preamble. That was Sylvia. And rejection. 3 deficiencies. Wrong plan classification. He filed it as a private defined benefit structure instead of a state-administered RSA account. Incorrect benefit calculation method. He used a standard marital share formula the RSA does not recognize. And the alternate payee language failed RSA compliance review. A brief pause. The filing has been rejected at the administrative level. The correction window is now extremely narrow. I did not respond immediately. "Rayatha." "I heard you," I said quietly. "Thank you, Sylvia." I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment with my coffee cooling in my hand. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt in that moment, because it was not what most people would expect. It was not triumph. It was not relief, exactly. What arrived was something slower and more precise than either of those things. It was the feeling of a mechanism completing, the quiet, almost administrative sensation of watching something work the way it was designed to work. I had known this was the likely outcome since Sylvia first explained the RSA requirements 4 months earlier. I had structured everything around timing, preparation, and the possibility that Douglas Peel would treat the filing like a routine pension division instead of the specialized administrative process it actually was. But likelihood is not certainty. Until that phone call, there had still been the possibility that Douglas corrected course early, that he brought in pension counsel, that the filing landed before the retirement processing crossed the threshold Sylvia had warned me about. The risk had always been real, and even now, Sylvia had not described the situation as fatal, just damaged. That distinction mattered. An hour later, she called again. "Douglas submitted a request to amend the filing," she said. "The RSA acknowledged receipt, but processing has continued in the meantime. So he moved quickly. Quickly enough to understand he has a problem," Sylvia corrected. "Not necessarily quickly enough to solve it." She explained that retirement systems did not freeze themselves simply because attorneys needed corrections. Elections continued processing. Internal review dates continued moving. And every day spent repairing foundational filing errors reduced the space available for meaningful review before benefit activation locked portions of the process down. "He should have brought in pension counsel before the first submission," Sylvia said plainly. "Now he's correcting while the clock is already running." After we hung up, I left the coffee on the counter and went to sit in the chair by the window, the one I used when I needed to think without a desk in front of me. I thought about the retirement gathering, the envelope hitting the table, the way Wendell had stood across from me with the practiced stillness of a man who believed the hard work was already behind him. I thought about the pen I had brought myself, my own pen, not his, and the 7 words I had spent 3 months making calm enough to deliver without a tremor. I thought about his laugh. That laugh had been the fullest expression of what Wendell believed about me in the end. That I was a woman who could be managed, positioned, outmaneuvered by a man with a plan, and an attorney, and a retirement date circled on a calendar. He had laughed because he was certain. And certainty, in my experience, is the most dangerous condition a person can be in. It stops people from reviewing assumptions that should have been reviewed twice. Douglas Peel was not a stupid lawyer. That was important. He was a lawyer who handled enough ordinary divorce filings successfully that he assumed this filing was ordinary too. 3 deficiencies. Any one of them capable of triggering rejection. All 3 present in a single filing submitted to an institution that published its requirements openly for anyone disciplined enough to read them carefully. The pension claim was not dead yet, but it was wounded badly. And more importantly, retirement processing had already moved forward, while Douglas was now being forced to correct foundational problems under shrinking administrative timelines. That changed the balance of the case. I sat in that chair most of the day, not celebrating, thinking, because I understood something Wendell still did not. When a strategy depends on timing, delay becomes damage. I did not call Sylvia back until the following morning. When she answered, I said simply, "What's next?" His name on my screen was still spelled the way I had saved it years ago. Wendell. No last name, no label, just Wendell. The way you save someone when you cannot imagine needing to distinguish them from anything else in your life. I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. Riatha. His voice was measured. Careful in the way that people are careful when they have rehearsed an opening and want it to land as spontaneous. I had heard that register from him before. In difficult conversations with contractors, in moments where he needed to reframe something that had not gone the way he planned, he was performing reasonableness. "Wendell, I've been thinking," he said, "that the way things have been handled, by both sides, maybe got away from us a little. I think there's probably a conversation worth having, as 2 people who spent a life together." I let a moment pass before responding. "What kind of conversation?" "A reasonable one." He paused. "I don't think either of us wants this to drag on longer than it needs to. There may be room to revisit some of the terms, simplify things." I understood exactly what was happening. Wendell had learned about the QDRO rejection, probably within the last 48 hours, based on the timing of this call. Douglas Peel had delivered news that required an emergency strategy adjustment, and Wendell's first move was to come directly to me. Not through attorneys, directly, which told me he was trying to assess how much I knew before deciding how much he needed to concede. He wanted to read me. I had no intention of being readable. "I think Sylvia handles anything related to terms," I said. "That's what she's there for." "I'm not talking about attorneys, Riatha. I'm talking about 2 adults. We are 2 adults with active legal representation. Sylvia handles the terms." A short silence. He was recalibrating. I could hear it in the quality of the quiet, the specific texture of a person deciding which angle to try next. "I just think," he said, "that some of the filings may have created complications that weren't necessary. On both sides. Things that could be addressed without making everything more difficult." There it was. Not an apology. Not a confession. A probe, dressed in the language of mutual inconvenience to disguise the fact that only one side had experienced a complication. I let another moment pass. "I received a copy of the RSA administrator's letter," I said. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way he probably did not realize. The careful reasonableness was still there on the surface, but something beneath it had shifted. A tightening, a recalculation happening in real time. "There are processes for addressing those kinds of administrative responses," he said. "Douglas is looking into the options." "I'm sure he is," I said. Nothing more. Another silence. Shorter this time. He was trying to find a foothold, and the conversation was not offering him one. Every response I gave was precise enough to confirm I understood the situation, and brief enough to give him nothing to work with. "I'll let Sylvia know you're open to a conversation," I said. "She'll be in touch." I ended the call before he could respond. I set the phone down and sat very still for a moment. He had called to find out how much I knew. Now he knew that I knew everything, and he had no idea what I was going to do with it. Reverend Spears caught me in the parking lot after the second service. He was not a man who rushed toward difficult things. In 20 years of attending his church, I had watched him navigate more family fractures, more quiet community crises, more situations where the truth was complicated, and the people involved were sitting in the same pews. And he had always moved toward those situations the same way, deliberately, with the specific patience of a man who understood that how you approach a person in pain matters as much as what you say when you get there. He fell into step beside me, and we walked for a moment without speaking. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that I am not here as anyone's messenger. I know that, Reverend. I'm here because you have been a part of this community for a long time, and because what's being said deserves to be—" He paused, choosing carefully. Balanced. I stopped walking. I turned to face him. "Tell me what's being said." He did. All of it. Wendell had been present at 3 community gatherings in the past 2 months, the kind of gatherings where Birmingham's professional and church communities overlapped, where reputations were built and revised over coffee and careful conversation. At each one, he had worked the same narrative with minor variations. A wife, consumed by her career. A man who had supported her ambitions at the cost of his own. A marriage he had tried to hold together while she had prioritized everything else. He had been specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to avoid accountability. He had not said anything that could be directly refuted, only things that could be believed by people who did not have the full picture. And some people did believe him, Reverend Spears said quietly. I said nothing. "Not everyone," he continued, "but enough that the conversations became divided." He explained it carefully. Some people saw a husband embarrassed publicly at a retirement party and reacted emotionally before they reacted logically. Some older couples in the church viewed divorce itself as failure, regardless of circumstances. A few men sympathized with the idea of living in the shadow of an accomplished wife. One woman had said she could not imagine building a marriage where work did not eventually come first. Not attacks, not cruelty, just people fitting incomplete information into the shapes of their own lives. That felt more honest to me than universal support would have. Reverend Spears delivered all of this without editorializing. He was, in his way, doing exactly what I did, presenting information and allowing it to carry its own weight. When he finished, I looked at him for a moment. Then I opened my bag and took out a small notebook, the kind I carried for exactly these situations, because a woman in my position learned early that memory is disputable and documentation is not. I had written 3 dates on the first page that morning before service. I had known, from the moment Phyllis mentioned the gatherings 2 weeks ago, that this conversation was coming. 3 dates, I said. That's all. I showed him the notebook. My announced retirement date, the date Wendell's attorney filed the pension order, and the date the RSA rejected that filing. I kept my voice level. I'm not asking you to take sides, Reverend. I'm asking you to hold those 3 dates next to the narrative you just described and tell me what the sequence says. He looked at the notebook for a long moment. He was a man who understood sequences, who had built a ministry on the understanding that the order in which things happen tells you something that the events themselves, standing alone, cannot. And because he was honest, he did not answer immediately. I respected him more for that. Finally, he handed the notebook back without a word. But something in his expression had shifted. Not certainty. Recognition. We stood there for a moment in the parking lot with the late morning sun coming down flat and warm across the asphalt. I appreciate your time, Reverend, I said. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the church entrance. slowly, the way he walked toward everything that required thinking about. I watched him go. I did not need to follow. I did not need to manage what happened next. The sequence would do that on its own. Truth, in my experience, does not need a spokesperson. It just needs to be placed in the right hands. Phyllis chose the restaurant. That told me something. She was not a woman who made casual selections. Every choice Phyllis Garrett made had a reason behind it. Which table she requested, which day she suggested, which version of a conversation she was prepared to have before she sat down. We had worked alongside each other at Brookside Regional for 19 years. I knew how she operated. She had chosen somewhere quiet, midweek, away from the hospital district. She wanted to say something she had been holding for weeks without anyone we worked with overhearing it. We ordered. We talked about small things for the first few minutes. The comfortable preamble of two women who have known each other long enough to understand that sometimes you need to arrive at the real conversation gradually. Then Phyllis set down her fork, folded her hands on the table, and looked at me with the expression I had been expecting since she called to suggest lunch. "I need to tell you some things," she said, "and I need you to just let me get through them." "Go ahead." She started with the hospital. The consensus among senior staff, unspoken, the way institutional consensus usually is, expressed through tone and omission rather than declaration, was that what Wendell had done at the retirement gathering had been noted and categorized, not discussed openly, simply filed. The way professional communities file things that reveal character. Several colleagues who had once been cordial with Wendell had become unavailable in the specific way people become unavailable when they decide someone is no longer worth the social investment. Invitations shortened, conversations cooled, follow-up calls disappeared, not punishment, recalibration. But not everyone landed in the same place. Phyllis added carefully. A few people think the divorce should have stayed private. A couple of the older board members felt the hospital crowd judged him too quickly. I listened without interrupting. One donor said your career probably created pressures nobody else saw, she continued. And one of the physicians told me he thought the whole thing looked like two people who stopped knowing how to live in the same room. Not defense, not support exactly, but not condemnation either. That mattered more because it sounded real. Then she told me about the events. Wendell had attended a healthcare industry reception 3 weeks after day 0. He had arrived the way he always arrived at those functions, with the easy confidence of a man who expected rooms to receive him. 3 people within the first 20 minutes had asked where Riatha was before engaging with him directly. Not unkindly, just first. As though his presence now required context he could no longer provide on his own. He tried to turn it into a joke, Phyllis said quietly. People laughed politely. Then the conversations moved on without him. That detail mattered more than open hostility would have. Open hostility creates drama. Professional distancing creates isolation. He stayed 40 minutes and left before the program started. The second event was a Brookside Regional Community Partnership dinner 2 weeks later. His name was not on the program. He attended as a guest, which was what he had always technically been. Phyllis said, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a truth they had carefully considered before saying aloud. A guest. Present because of my affiliation, my relationships, my 27 years of institutional investment. Without me beside him, the rooms were the same rooms. The people were the same people. But the doors opened differently. Then Phyllis said something she had clearly debated saying before lunch even started. He kept trying to tell people the divorce was mutual, she said, that the timing had just surprised everyone. I looked at her. And nobody believed that either. She hesitated. Not nobody, she corrected quietly. Some people wanted to. Especially the ones who already thought successful women asked too much from marriages. But the people who actually worked beside you for years? She shook her head once. No, they saw it for what it was. The room between us went quiet for a moment. That was the real shift, not gossip, not scandal, pattern recognition. Professional communities survive by learning how to read character quickly, hospitals especially. You spend enough years in executive spaces and you develop instincts about people who perform integrity versus people who carry it naturally. Wendell had mistaken proximity for ownership for so long that he genuinely believed the rooms would keep receiving him the same way after removing the woman who built the relationships holding those rooms open. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Phyllis was not telling me this to satisfy my ego. I knew her too well for that. She was telling me because she had watched something happen at that retirement gathering that unsettled her deeply. And she needed me to understand that the people who mattered had seen it clearly. Nobody who knows you, she said quietly, believes his version. I looked at her across the table. 19 years. She had watched me build every piece of what I had built inside that institution. She had been in rooms where I was the only woman, the only Black executive, the only person who had to be twice as prepared to be taken half as seriously. She knew exactly what borrowed access looked like. So did I. Thank you, Phyllis, I said. She picked up her fork. We finished lunch. Audrea called on a Saturday morning, not a text, a call, which told me before she said anything that what she was carrying was too specific for a message. I answered on the second ring, and she went straight to it the way she always did, without preamble, in that careful, measured voice I had come to understand, was not coldness, but precision. I thought you should know, she said. Desiree ended it with Wendell. It happened Thursday. I did not respond immediately. I moved from the kitchen to the chair by the window, the same chair I had used the morning Sylvia called about the RSA rejection, and sat down. How do you know? Someone who knows her mentioned it, and she confirmed it herself when a mutual contact asked directly. Audrea paused. She wasn't quiet about why. The why was this, and Audrea told it to me the way she told me everything, without editorial, just the facts arranged in the order they happened. Sometime in the weeks following the QDRO rejection, the story had traveled the way stories travel in Birmingham, through professional adjacency, through the particular overlap of healthcare administration, legal offices, and social networks, where people know each other well enough to connect details without being directly told to. Not gossip, exactly. Recognition. Desiree worked in logistics in Hoover. That world sat close enough to the edges of the world where the RSA filing story had begun surfacing quietly. Someone mentioned the consulting firm, mentioned the pension issue, mentioned the rejected filing. Not dramatically. Just conversationally enough for a woman already sensing cracks to start asking questions. And Desiree did what intelligent people do when something stops sounding right. She went looking. Public business filings are not hidden documents. The ownership structure of Delaney Health Consulting, documented, time-stamped, formally structured long before the retirement gathering, was a matter of public record. What Desiree found when she looked told her in plain language what Wendell had never said plainly. The firm was not his, had never been his. But according to Audrea, she did not leave immediately after finding that out. First, she confronted him. Wendell told her the filings were misleading. That ownership structures had been arranged for tax purposes during the marriage. That Sylvia was deliberately slowing access to marital assets. That the pension issue was temporary and already being corrected. And for a short time, Desiree believed him enough to stay. That detail mattered to me. Because intelligent women do not usually abandon entire futures over one uncomfortable conversation. They look for explanations first. They try to reconcile the version of a person they trusted with the information now sitting in front of them. But explanations require consistency. And Wendell's story kept changing. The pension problem became minor paperwork. Then Sylvia manipulating timing. Then the state system creating delays. Every version sounded slightly different from the one before it. Meanwhile, the public records stayed exactly the same. And once she started pulling at those threads, the rest of the story unraveled quickly. What Wendell actually had, standing alone without the architecture of my career beneath him, was a lease on a 2-bedroom unit in a complex off Highway 280 and a car note with 14 months remaining. She had wanted a house with a yard. More than that, she had wanted stability that was real. That was the part Wendell had never understood. Women like Desiree are not usually chasing fantasy. They are chasing certainty, predictability, a future they can place their weight on without falling through it. Wendell had offered her a performance and called it a plan. She left on a Thursday. No public confrontation, no dramatic exposure scene that anyone witnessed. She simply stopped participating in the version of the future Wendell had been selling her. Audrea finished and the line was briefly silent. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I thought you deserved to know." After we hung up, I sat in the chair for a while without moving. I was not thinking about Desiree with satisfaction. What I felt was something more specific and less comfortable than that. The particular weight of watching a man arrive at the exact destination his choices had been building toward, and understanding that no version of this outcome felt like victory. Wendell had constructed an entire future around a version of his life that existed mostly inside his own telling. He had been specific about it. The house, the resources, the life waiting on the other side of a divorce he had spent months engineering. He had convinced someone to believe it. And now he was standing in a 2-bedroom unit off Highway 280 with a damaged pension claim, a car note, and a Thursday that had stripped the fantasy down to what was actually there. He was holding none of what the plan was supposed to produce, not one piece of it. I stood up, went to the kitchen, started the coffee. There was one thing left. Sylvia's office was the same as it had always been. Ordered, precise, the kind of room that does not change based on what is happening inside it, which was, I had come to understand, entirely intentional. Sylvia operated in a space designed to communicate that whatever you brought through the door, the room had seen worse and remained standing. She had the documents laid out before I sat down. "I want to walk through everything in sequence," she said. "No summaries, every item in full." I nodded. She started with the pension. "The administrative correction window closed 14 days ago," she said. "The RSA confirmed in writing that the filing deficiencies could not be cured within the remaining processing timeline after retirement activation." She slid the letter toward me. "The issue was not one mistake," she continued calmly. "It was cumulative structural deficiency combined with timing. Douglas attempted corrective filings after the initial rejection, but the retirement election had already moved into benefit processing status by then. Once that happened, alternate payee review became substantially restricted." I read the letter once. Sylvia continued before I could speak. "He also consulted pension counsel after the second rejection notice, but by that point, the RSA had already classified the matter as administratively late. There was no judicial shortcut available to reopen the review window after activation." No triumph in her voice, no performance, just facts. Wendell's pension claim was not delayed. It was not awaiting reconsideration. The filing had been administratively dismissed and closed. No courtroom drama, no dramatic judicial speech, just procedure. Sylvia said it without inflection. I received it the same way. Then she moved to the consulting firm. Delaney Health Consulting was documented as independently operated and substantially traceable to my direct professional development, client acquisition, and pre-existing business foundation. The restructuring Sylvia and I completed before day zero had produced a paper trail Douglas Peel challenged twice during proceedings and failed to materially undermine either time. Not untouchable by magic. Untouchable by documentation. That distinction mattered to me. The marital home came next. Equity division. Specific figures. Specific terms. A negotiated buyout structure that gave me clean title within 90 days. I would not need to move. The home I had maintained for 21 years would remain mine without dispute. Then Sylvia set down the page she had been reading from and looked at me directly. "There is one more item," she said, "and I want you to understand it fully because Wendell's team only recently calculated its long-term implications." She explained it plainly. 27 years of marriage entitled me, under federal Social Security law, to claim divorced spouse benefits on Wendell's earnings record when eligible, potentially up to 50% depending on timing and election structure. Not a division of his monthly benefit. Not a reduction of what he personally received. A separate legal entitlement calculated from the same earnings history. "He cannot prevent you from claiming it," Sylvia said, "and the entitlement survives independently of his preferences." The room was quiet. I looked at the documents spread across her desk, every figure correct, every term documented, every protection I had spent 4 months reinforcing, now standing exactly where I had placed it. 27 years reduced to paper. Organized, settled, final. I had imagined, in the months of preparation, that this moment would feel larger somehow. A release, perhaps, or the satisfaction of watching a plan complete itself exactly the way I intended. What I actually felt was stillness, not emptiness. Something more considered than that. The particular quiet of a woman who fought for something she should never have had to fight for and won every piece of it, while understanding that victory does not return the energy required to survive the fight itself. I thought about the retirement gathering, the envelope, the laugh, the certainty. Wendell had built an entire strategy around the assumption that I would respond emotionally while he responded structurally. What he never understood was that structure had always been my language too. I picked up the pen. I signed where Sylvia indicated. When I set the pen down, she looked at me and said simply, "It's done." I straightened the pages in front of me. "Yes," I said quietly, "it is." The doorbell rang at 2:30 on a Saturday. I was not expecting anyone. I looked at the door for a moment before I moved toward it, not from fear, but from the specific instinct of a woman who has spent the last 6 months understanding that unexpected arrivals carry information. I opened the door. Tercel was standing on the porch alone, no Audrea. He was dressed plainly, the kind of clothes a man puts on when he is not trying to present anything, which told me more than a prepared appearance would have. He looked like he had been carrying something heavy for long enough that he had stopped trying to hide the weight of it. He did not say anything immediately. Neither did I. "Can I come in?" he said. Not a question. A request that understood it might be declined. I stepped back from the door. He sat in the living room in the chair across from the sofa. Not the closer one, the farther one, which told me he was not assuming comfort or proximity. I sat on the sofa and waited. This was his arrival. He would have to begin it. "I don't know how to start," he said. "Then start badly," I said. "Just start." He looked at his hands. Then he looked at me. "I didn't know what Audrea had done. I didn't know she came to you. She never told me." "I know she didn't." Something moved across his face. "Then you knew, the whole time, that I didn't have the full picture." "Yes." He absorbed that. The specific difficulty of understanding that his mother had known, for months, that his betrayal was built on incomplete information, and had said nothing, had not used it to soften her position or negotiate his return. "That doesn't excuse what I did," he said quietly. "No," I said. "It doesn't." The room was quiet for a moment. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say to my son if this conversation ever arrived. Not in anger. I had moved past anger months ago. In clarity. The same clarity I had brought to every other decision in the past year. "What your silence cost you," I said, "was not my respect. You had that before you chose, and you could have kept it. What it cost you was the knowledge of who you are when the stakes are real and the choice is hard. You found out something about yourself that Sunday, at that dinner table, and you have had to live with that answer every day since." He did not look away. "I backed the wrong side," he said. "You backed the side you thought would win," I said. "That's a different thing. And I need you to understand the difference before anything else between us moves forward." The room held that for a long moment. He was 34 years old. He was my son. He had my eyes and his father's jaw and a silence at dinner tables that he was going to have to decide, going forward, what to do with. I looked at him steadily. "I'm not closing this door," I said. "But I'm not opening my arms and calling it resolved because you showed up. What comes next is entirely your decision. What you build from here, with me, with Audria, with yourself, that is yours to construct." He nodded once, slowly. He sat with that for a while. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "I'll do better," he said. I held his gaze. "I know you will," I said. "Show me." The coffee was ready before I was. That was new. Not the coffee. The readiness. For most of my adult life, I had woken up already moving, already calculating the first 3 decisions of the day before my feet touched the floor. 27 years of marriage. 31 years of professional obligation. A lifetime of being the person in every room who understood that if she stopped moving, something would go unmanaged. This Saturday morning, I sat down at my kitchen table and did nothing for a while. Just sat. The consulting firm had posted its strongest quarter in 11 years. 3 new county contracts, 2 staff additions, a partnership with Brookside Regional that I had negotiated independently, on my own terms, at my own table, without anyone beside me whose ego required managing. Delaney Health Consulting was not a side enterprise anymore. It was the main thing. It had always had the capacity to be the main thing. It had simply required the removal of everything that had been compressing it. The gala had been 2 weeks prior. I had not been required to attend. The fellowship naming had been communicated to me in advance. The honor was settled regardless of my presence. I went because I wanted to. Because there is a difference between showing up because you are expected to, and showing up because you have earned the right to stand in a room without apology. The Riatha J. Colston Community Health Fellowship. My name on something that would outlast every version of this year. I had worn the green dress. I had arrived alone and left when I was ready. Wendell had not been there. He would not have been added to the program regardless. That particular room had completed its quiet recalibration months ago. I had not engineered that. I had not needed to. Rooms that were built on genuine contribution do not require instruction on how to redistribute themselves when the contribution is finally correctly attributed. He was simply no longer present in the places that mattered, not because of anything I had done to remove him, because of everything he had revealed about himself in the attempt to remove me. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and looked out the kitchen window at the yard. 9 months ago, I had stood in a room full of people who had spent decades watching me build something. And a man had placed an envelope on a table and laughed at 7 words I whispered. The pension, the firm, the record, all mine. He had laughed because he believed I was performing confidence I did not have. Because in his understanding of me, even after 27 years, I was a woman who could be rattled if you timed the blow correctly. He had spent months constructing the timing. He had walked into that room certain. He had never understood that the words were not a threat. They were a ledger. Every item already accounted for, every protection already in place, every document already signed, time-stamped, and counsel approved before he produced a single page of his own. I had not been bluffing. I had been reading him his future, and the life on the other side of that whisper, this kitchen, this Saturday, this coffee going warm in my hands with no agenda and no performance, and no one to manage or protect myself from. This was not something I had built in response to what he did. I had built it long before he decided to make his move. He had simply made it visible. I took a slow sip of coffee. Outside the window, the yard was quiet, and the morning was full, and there was nowhere I needed to be. I stayed right where I was.